saludo para todos, muchas gracias. Le doy la palabra a Andrés.
Gracias, Germán, presidente de AFHIC. Primero voy a hablar en español y después me voy a pasar el inglés. Tenemos el gusto de tener hoy un profesor Stephen French y que nos va a dar una conferencia. Stephen French es profesor titular de Filosofía de la Ciencia en la Universidad de Leeds, en Inglaterra. Estudió en la Universidad de Newcastle y la Universidad de Londres. E inició su carrera académica en la Universidad de Campinas. Eso es muy importante para nosotros. No sé cuántos años estuvo. How many years you were in Campinas? 5? 4?
No, I think only 3.5.
Okay, so he started in Campinas. Sus principales áreas de investigación han sido filosofía de la ciencia, especialmente modelos y la concepción semántica, representación y realismo estructural, del cual es uno de los más destacados proponentes. Filosofía de la física, especialmente fundamentos de la mecánica cuántica, historia de la física, particularmente la del siglo XX. En estas áreas ha publicado una decena de influyentes libros, muchos artículos y coeditado 2 importantes libros. Varios de estas publicaciones han sido con la autoría con destacados miembros de AFHIC. Newton da Costa, que todos conocemos, miembro honorario de AFHIC. Decio Krause, con el cual he escrito mucho sobre mecánica cuántica, y Octavio Bueno, que tenemos el gusto que están aquí y ha publicado muchas cosas en conjunto. Steven está en proceso de retirarse, pero afortunadamente para él, hasta hace poco fue coeditor jefe del British Journal for the Philosophy of Science, y también editor jefe de la serie de Palgrave Macmillan, New Directions in Philosophy of Science. I'm going to switch to English. So his main books, well, he has 10 books, plenty of books, but in his website, he says my 5 most recent selected publications. The first one is the book, There Are No Such Things as Such Theories. And that's the book he will be talking about some aspects of it. There's another text that is Between Factorialism and Substructuralism. Structuralism as a third way, Applying Mathematics, Immersion, Inference, Interpretation, an article on Art, Science, and Abstract Artifacts, a book Building Bridges with the Right Tools, Modality, and the Standard Model. There's plenty of books. There is one that he likes very much, Semi-Realism, Sociability, and Structure. You can search that in the website. And in that place, you can find the people that Stephen has supervised in their PhD. And that's a very amazing list. There's many people that you may know. And that's, for us, is quite interesting. One of them is Octavio, that is there. He was supervised by Stephen. Another one, well, maybe you know, the list is there. I have it here somewhere, but there's not much. James Laden, that is quite famous. And I was happy to be also one of those students of Stephen. I was so happy to have him as my PhD supervisor. He accepted in something that is not in the core of his interest, that is something like philosophy of paraconsistent logic, but he was very kind with me. For me, and accepted that and helped me a lot. So for me, this is very important. And it's also very important for something. We have been inviting Stephen for many years to come to Latin America, to South America. I have invited him to come to Jornada Chuaquito when we made AFHIC in Chile, and we invite him, and say, no, I'm busy. I don't know, maybe he's afraid of traveling or something like that. But this time I emailed to him to say, well, that's no way out. You have to come to AFHIC. There is no excuse this time. You have to come to AFHIC because this is the opportunity. So one of the very few good things of this pandemic is that we are going to have Stephen here, and he will deliver this talk to us. So in AFHIC, we are very happy to have finally Stephen French between us. So thank you very much, Stephen, for being here. And go ahead, Stephen.
Well, thank you for that very gracious introduction. And thank you, Andres and Germán, for inviting me. Thank you all for attending from wherever you are around the world. So the title of my talk is, Does the claim that there are no theories imply that there is no history of theories to be written? And I'll explain the title, paraphrase of a phrase by a famous historian. So here's the breakdown of my talk. I'm going to begin with a little bit of propaganda about my book, push the book a little bit. Book explore three implications of what I try to establish in the book. One has to do with how we as philosophers of science should look at the history of science. And I'll be talking a little bit about the history of quantum mechanics, but with no technicalities or anything like that. Then I'll be looking at the implications of what I say in the book for how we, again, philosophers, should understand the devices we use. And what I mean by that are things like the semantic approach, and in particular, the partial structures version of the semantic approach that Newton da Costa and Ottavio and myself have tried to develop and apply to various cases. And then I'll be looking at the implications for the relationship between the history of science and the philosophy of science, talking a little bit about some recent work by other people on notions of reinforcement and reconstruction, and then a quick conclusion. So that's the breakdown of the talk. Okay, here's the book. OUP produced quite a nice cover for it, I think. And here's the core kind of thesis. The book is an extended argument against the reification of scientific theories. And I think that reification is both implicit and explicit. I think it's implicit in many of the discussions of representation in science. That's a big topic in the philosophy of science over the last 20 or 30 years, with various accounts put forward to accommodate this representational relationship between theories and phenomena, systems, the world, whatever. And typically, these accounts designed to embrace both theories and artworks. There's an interesting sort of exchange or to and fro between the philosophy of art and the philosophy of science in this regard. But I began to suspect some years ago that thinking of the way that paintings represent perhaps implicitly conditioned the view of theories insofar as they represent the phenomena, the view of theories as things, as entities, as well-defined, as having well-defined identity conditions. And sometimes that view was made explicit by certain recent writers like Rongiri, regarding theories and models as abstract entities. And that explicit view of theories as things is apparent famously in the work of Karl Popper, for example, in his allocation of theories to what he called World 3, the world of artworks, works of literature, like Hamlet, music, Beethoven's Fifth, and so on. And you also find it, I think, expressed in a quite sophisticated and interesting way by Amy Thomason, Ottavio's former colleague at the University of Miami, in her view of artworks as abstract artifacts. Artworks and theories on this view, abstract, but they're artifactual in the sense that they are created and sustained by human intentions. A great deal of my book is taken up with trying to both expose these views and then argue that they generate multiple problems, particularly with how we view scientific heuristics, scientific discovery. I mean, even that very word discovery is problematic, as if theories are somehow out there we either trip over or that we have privileged access to somehow. And I think these kinds of accounts, these that reify theories, generate significant problems with understanding the practice of science. A great deal of the book is spent exploring those problems. And the solution to the problems is a bit, well, you can compare it to Alexander cutting the Gordian knot, is to eliminate theories, to insist that there are no such things as theories. There are no abstract entities that can be called theories. It's an eliminativist position. First thing to note is that that doesn't imply that there are no such things as electrons, okay? So to be an anti-realist or a nominalist about theories as things does not imply in any way that one has to be an anti-realist about electrons. You can be, if you want to be. the likes of Ottavio and I will disagree about that, but that's fine. That's completely separate from the position taken with regard to theories. But of course, being an eliminativist does itself generate certain problems. We talk about theories, we ascribe qualities to theories, features to them. We say things like quantum mechanics is difficult, quantum mechanics is elegant. How can we make sense of that talk if we insist that there are no such things as theories? There's a metaphysical device that a former colleague of mine, Ross Cameron, suggested, and this is to modify what's known as truth maker theory. So standardly, if you take a proposition, snow is white, that's the bearer, that's the truth bearer. The truth maker would be the state of affairs, snow is white. But Ross suggested that the truth maker of certain propositions doesn't have to be the state of affairs or the entities or whatever referred to in those propositions. And he suggested this for the case of musical work, so that you could make certain claims about musical works, certain claims that you can take to be true, while still not insisting that there are no abstract entities corresponding to those musical works. What makes the claims true is something else. And in the case of theories, in the book, I suggest that what makes our claims about theories true are scientific practices. So take the claim quantum mechanics is elegant. What makes that claim true is a certain set of practices, whether we engage it on the whiteboard, on a piece of paper, in talking with our colleagues, or whatever. This aesthetic quality should not be thought of as attaching to some abstract entity. Rather, it has to do with the practice of mathematical derivation and so forth that we engage in. That's not to say that theories are constituted by or reduced to such practices. There are views that hold that, but remember, I'm denying that they're theories. Okay, so I'm adopting this eliminativist view. Again, what I'm insisting on is that these practices make true certain claims that are putatively about theories. And so that's basically the book, the core of my book is about. And it's been subjected to some critical reviews recently, which is always nice. There's a symposium that just came out in Metascience with Chris Pincock, Sebastian Lutz, and Finnur Delson on the book. There's an essay review coming out in the journal Mind by Neil Dewar, and Hans Halvorsen also has a critical review coming out in the Journal for General Philosophy of Science. And I mention that because all of them, I think, say something quite similar, which is that what I don't do in the book is really expand on the implications of this eliminativist position. And that's precisely what I want to do here. I want to try and correct that by at least indicating some possible implications. Whether you find them plausible or not, we'll see. Hopefully you'll find them interesting, as I say, implications for how we should view the history of science, how we should understand the devices that we use, devices like, or as embodied in the semantic approach, and the implications for the relationship between the history of science and the philosophy of science. So let's consider the first set of implications. As I said, my title is a paraphrase of something written by Quentin Skinner, famous British historian, and the paraphrase was by Theo Arabtzis, a historian and philosophy of science in Greece. And Quentin Skinner wrote a quite famous piece back in the 60s, pushing back against the idea that we can identify in the history of ideas as sort of well-defined entities, and suggesting that as soon as we see that there is no determinate idea to which various writers contributed, then what we are seeing is equally that there is no history of the idea to be written. And Theo adopted a paraphrase of that in his book, Representing Electrons, A Biographical Approach. And as he said, that might sound odd to some people, adopting a biographical approach to theoretical entities like the electron. But what he meant by that is that what he wanted to do in this history is to focus on the experimental situations and the theoretical practices associated with the electron. So that what he was giving as his biography was really a history of successive representations. And he insisted on remaining neutral with regard to the ontological issues of, do electrons exist, and the whole realism, anti-realism debate. That's, I think, meshes very nicely, I think, with the kind of stance I'm suggesting in the book. Although rather than remain neutral on the existence of theories, I've adopted this eliminativist stance. But I think what that encourages us to do is to look at the history of science not as a history of theories that can somehow be, well identified and that correspond in some way to these abstract entities, abstract artifacts, whatever you want to call them. Instead, we should see the history of science as a history of, quite a complex history of different practices. Okay, so here's my take on the history of quantum mechanics. So here's the standard history, right? This is the history that we usually present. It's the kind of history I would present when I taught history and philosophy of physics to physics students, for example. And the usual story goes, by the mid-1920s, you had two formulations of the theory: Heisenberg's matrix mechanics, Schrodinger's wave mechanics, apparently quite different. Then along comes von Neumann, and he shows how both can be understood as different representations of this more fundamental account of vectors in Hilbert space. And that comes to be identified with the theory. Okay, and Fred Muller has a very nice paper on this, on how these two were shown to be equivalent and various issues with that, from the point of view of the semantic approach to theories, which regards theories in terms of set theoretic models. It's the approach developed by Patrick Suppes, Fred Suppy, Beth, and others. And the standard history continues and says that equivalence helped cement into place the quantum revolution. And we might sort of, point at Kuhn and the structure of scientific revolutions at this point, even though there's actually very little in that book on quantum mechanics for reasons that, we can talk about if you want, but I'll indicate on the next slide. And around the same time, there was what you might call the Copenhagen cohesion, that the interpretation of the theory cohered around certain thoughts of the so-called Copenhagen school, led by Niels Bohr. And that's the standard history. The thing is, as those of you who have dug into that history to any extent will know, the true history is actually much more complicated and complex and interesting. So there wasn't just two formulations in play from 25 to 27, Heisenberg's matrix mechanics and Schrodinger's wave mechanics. There were various formulations. There were Dirac and Jordan's transformation calculus. There was Weyl's group theoretic approach. There are other formulations as well. Granted that we can show certain equivalences and relations between them, thinking of these as somehow naturally heading towards the theory, at the very least, glosses over a number of interesting and fairly nuanced interrelationships and a very interesting history. Likewise, thinking of von Neumann as, in effect, cementing into place the theory is contentious as well. So an early career researcher in this area, Christopher Mitch, I think he's at the University of California, presented recently a very nice paper saying that actually what von Neumann was doing in his great book on quantum mechanics wasn't cementing into place the theory. He was adopting a methodology that he took from Hilbert of what he called axiomatic completion, essentially taking what von Neumann saw as the core characteristics of the various practices that were going on at the time, from Dirac and Heisenberg and Schrödinger and others, and axiomatizing them in terms of Hilbert space. And that offers a very different, I think, view of what von Neumann was trying to do. Likewise, we can question whether there was actually a quantum revolution in Kuhnian terms. There's a lovely book by a guy named Seth called Crafting the Quantum, which focuses on Sommerfeld's group in Munich. And the sense you get from that is, as I say on the slide, crisis, what crisis? These guys, these physicists were working away, trying to solve problems. There was no sense of some kind of crisis, much less a paradigm shift or any of that. And Seth points out that at the time of writing The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, or just, sorry, I think it was shortly before, Kuhn and others were interviewing, the great quantum physicists, basically before they died, for the American Institute of Physics Oral History Project. And time and again, the interviewees resolutely denied that there was an air of crisis. I mean, there's a famous interview with Heisenberg where he just says, no, we had no sense that there was a crisis. We were just trying to, crack these problems with regard, to the structure of the atom and so on. Likewise, thinking of this revolution in terms of a transition between classical and quantum physics is problematic. My colleague Graham Gooday, with his co-author, has written a very nice paper where they argue that the distinction between classical and quantum mechanics was elaborated over a period of years through the 1920s into the 1930s, and it was actually imposed post hoc after the core developments. And my point in sort of bringing all this to your attention is to suggest that eliminating theories from the history, pushing them off stage, actually opens up space for a much more nuanced and interesting and complex history. It's perhaps not the history that you would be able to present straightforwardly to undergraduates. That's true. And come back to what, the worth of certain, what we might call toy cases from the history of science later. But if we want to think about that history, more seriously for our own research and so forth, then I think pushing the notion of, this idea of quantum mechanics as the theory off center stage, as I say, opens up space for a much more interesting and nuanced history. What about the implications for how we should understand the devices that we use, like the semantic approach? So Theo Arabtz's biographical approach to the history of the electron, as I said, presents it as a history of representations of the electron. And as I also said, that's become the focus of considerable attention in the philosophy of science over the last 30 years. So we can take as an example of this notion of device that we as philosophers of science use to understand science, this notion of representation, that science represents the world. And we can capture that, according to some of us, in terms of the semantic approach. And here Van Fraasen's book entitled Scientific Representation is perhaps the leading monograph in the field. And as I indicated before, together with Newton da Costa and Ottavio, we've tried to articulate a partial structures, a variant of the semantic approach that we've argued in many papers and books is more adaptable, is more able to accommodate the openness of science, the relationships between theory and data. I think that was in one of Ottavio's first papers, and inter-theoretical relationships, as well as the applicability of mathematics to science. And that was the subject of the book that Ottavio and I published a few years ago. So how should we understand that device? A partial structures account of representation. Because, I mean, here's the issue. Someone might say, well, French, you're saying that there are no such things as theories. How are you going to understand that representational relationship? How can you have representation without the thing that's doing the representing? How can you have representation without the representation, without the theory? Well, here's the way I look at it, and I try to express this towards the end of the book. At the object level, as it were, at the level of which scientists themselves work, we might identify various practices of scientific representation. We can look at what scientists are actually doing, and they will say things like, yeah, we're trying to represent the world, we're trying to represent this system, and so forth. And then at the meta level, the level at which we philosophers of science operate, we can look at the philosophical representation of those practices. How do we capture those practices? How do we represent those practices? And the way we do that is through the semantic approach, through partial structures. So without theories as things, without theories as entities, without these abstract entities, what is standing in the relationship, in the representational relationship, is a meta-level construction, okay? So in effect, what we do is, I think, as philosophers of science, what I'm suggesting that what we do is that we look at those practices, and we select certain of those practices. We represent them in terms of our device, or via our device, the semantic approach, in terms of families of models understood as partial structures. And we say, right, that is the theory that is representing that phenomenon. Okay, and we do that to try and make sense for ourselves of scientific practice. So here's an example. And again, I'm not going to get into the technicalities. It's an old example, goes back to one of the first papers I wrote with James Laden back in the 1990s. The London Theory of Superconductivity. The name doesn't come from the city, it comes from two brothers, Fritz London and Heinz London. And Fritz London is a particular kind of hero of mine at the moment for other reasons. And what motivated their theory of superconductivity is a discovery that is known as came to be known as the Meissner effect. And in the Meissner effect, if you take a superconducting material and you impose a magnetic field on it, when you lower the temperature of the material, as it passes what's known as the transition temperature, the magnetic flux is expelled from the material. And the usual story is that was the clue that led people, particularly the London brothers, to realize that superconductivity was essentially a magnetic phenomenon. It had to do with magnetism. Now, that model was the subject of quite a short paper by Nancy Cartwright, Maurizio Suarez, and Tofik Shomar. And we'll just call them CSS. And they argued that it was a case study of what they called bottom-up phenomenological model building, in the sense that they claimed London built their model from the phenomena up without involving theory or without deriving it from theory. And because of that, they went on to claim the semantic approach, which they took to be claiming that theories are families of models. They argued that that approach cannot capture this bottom-up model building. So they use this case study in an attempt to undermine the semantic approach. So James Laden and I published a paper pushing back against this, and Ottavio and I and Newton and I subsequently published papers. I think Ottavio, James and I even published 2 papers together arguing against this view, and is known as the FLBD response, arguing that, in fact, if you look at the case study in more detail, you can see the role, you can discern the role of theory. And the London case is actually a case of theory-informed model building, sometimes characterized as top-down. And that this is not a problem for the semantic approach to capture. And even if it, I think in a paper with Newton, we argued that, well, even if it's not theory informed, even if CSS are right, the semantic approach could capture that bottom-up construction anyway. And the reason I mention all this is because there's a very nice paper that came out a couple of years ago by a young guy named Jan Potters, who basically says, as I say here, a plague on both your houses. You're both wrong. Both CSS and FLBD have got it wrong. And I won't go through the details of his paper. It is a very nice paper, very historically, I think, sophisticated, and goes into a lot of historical detail. The three theses, the three things that he claims are that, first of all, the interpretation of a model, that which it represents, shouldn't be taken as something established at the moment when the model is constructed, but rather it should be taken as something that is historically elaborated over time in such a way that it can then be successfully projected backwards onto the moment of construction. I'll come back to that in a second. Secondly, he says it's difficult to speak about the connection between the phenomenon and the model, since neither side of the connection should be seen as already stable in itself, but rather as constructed ensembles of different elements, experiments, theories, assumptions, models, etc., that changed over time. Essentially, he's arguing that not just the London and London model, but the actual understanding of the Meissner effect as a phenomenon was something that evolved over time and involved an ensemble of different elements. And finally, he says, this debate between CSS and FLBD is shaped by a particular philosophical conception of how scientific representation should be studied, as the discovery of a connection between a given experimental phenomenon and the meaning of the new equations. This approach clashes with the historical episode, but at the same time, this episode suggests an alternative way to study scientific representation, as the establishment over time of a connection between historically stabilized constellations of different elements that through discussion and engagement with alternative views and approaches come to constitute phenomenon and meaning. Interesting. So here's my response. In terms of my no theories view, with regard to the backward projection of interpretations, I'm very supportive and sympathetic, or supportive of and sympathetic to that kind of view. I think that is typically what happens. I think often what happens in the history of science, when scientists identify what they take to be the theory, it's always, or it's often involves this kind of backward projection. Perhaps this is controversial, but I think it's exemplified in the history of quantum mechanics. I think there is evidence to suggest that Max Planck, who's often presented in the history as, the father of quantum mechanics, the guy who discovered quantum theory in its early form, I think there's good evidence to suggest he actually didn't know quite what he had done in those papers in 1900 and 1901. And he subsequently reconstructed his own history to suit the later narrative that there was this emerging theory, as it were, already indicated by those papers. What about the second claim, that phenomena and models constructed ensembles of diverse elements? There I want to urge caution. I think that, first of all, when it comes to phenomena, the idea of phenomena as constructed ensembles can be problematic. It can be given a realist and an anti-realist gloss. I mean, there's a strong anti-realist line you could take on that. You could also be a realist and say, well, yeah, I represent, the phenomena, it is what it is. Sorry, they are what they are, but there's a sort of constructed ensemble of representations of it or whatever. I also am cautious about the claim that models should be thought of as constructed ensembles. That suggests the view that CSS hold, Cartwright, Suarez, and Schomar, that theories and models should be thought of as these kinds of collages of different elements, practices. And again, that is, in my mind, to reify theories again. And that's precisely what I want to avoid. But on the third suggestion, the idea or the third thesis, the idea that scientific practice should be seen as the establishment of a connection between historically stabilized constellations of different elements. Yes, that seems to mesh with my no theory stance. These constellations do not constitute or otherwise form a theory or a model, but together with the interrelationships between them, they make true certain statements about the theory or model. Potter's criticism is that both CSS and FLBD missed that richer history. And his claim really comes down to the fact that we miss this richer history, not only because we fail to understand that the Meissner effect was only stabilized as a phenomenon over time, but also because of our focus on the London and London account as a fully formed theory that emerged through various heuristic moves. And so essentially the lesson I think that can be drawn from this, and here I realize that I'm kind of, as it were, revising my own work together with, Ottavio and James and Newton. But the lesson that we can draw from this is that this implicit commitment on both sides of this debate to the reification of the London and London account led to a simplistic characterization in terms of either on the CSS side, a bottom-up construction, or on the FLBD side, a top-down construction. And that was unfortunate. Okay, now, one of the things that Potters doesn't discuss is this issue of the different devices that were deployed by CSS and FLBD. With CSS, CSS were keen, as I indicated, to undermine the semantic approach. And I think what's implicit to their account is a view of representation that Maurizio Suarez has subsequently elaborated on in a series of papers, in which representation is really only about inferential capacity. It's a very thin account, it's a very naturalistic account in the sense that he wants to avoid a kind of a formulation of it in terms of some sort of mapping or relationship of the kind that FLBD make explicit. We explicitly adopt the semantic approach, a form of mapping approach that can be thought of as a thick or formal account of representation. Now, what bearing does the case study have on this issue? Okay, Potters doesn't really discuss that. In personal correspondence and in response to a paper with Ottavio, Nancy Cartwright and Maurizio Suarez point out that the theories we refer to don't incorporate the formal features of the mapping approach themselves. The claim is, if you look at the theories, if you look at the London and London model, there's no mention of partial structures there or partial isomorphisms or anything like that. Our response is, or has been, well, of course not, because these features are features of the meta-level device, partial structures, that we, philosophers of science, are using to try and capture what we take to be this representational relationship. The twist that I've now added with the no theories view is that at the other end of that representational relationship, theoretical relatum, if you like, there isn't a thing, the theory, there is just our, as it were, construction in terms of the particular device that we're using, in this case, the semantic approach. So what do these devices do? Well, I think the most important thing they do, or one of the important things they do, is that they enable us to frame the narrative in a certain way. For the FLBD team, what was important was to show the various intertheoretic relationships, right, that one can discern in the practices, and to highlight, to exemplify those in terms of partial structures, so that we can see in that case study how those relationships emerged, and how, in effect, they give the lie to the claim that there was minimal theory involvement, or there was no top-down theory involvement in this case. And this is what I tried to express towards the end of the book. When we use the semantic approach to capture at the meta level the equivalence of, say, and going back to that earlier example, wave and matrix mechanics, as Fred Muller showed, then we're not representing something at the object level, namely quantum mechanics as formulated in terms of Hilbert space. What we're doing is presenting a construction that enables us as philosophers of science to make sense of certain features of scientific practice. And different sets of features can be captured in different ways, either within the semantic approach or using other formal devices entirely, without any commitment to one or other such device uniquely representing the theory. So, in a sense, I'm acceding to a kind of pluralism here. I think Sebastian Lutz, for example, has done impressive work in resuscitating what used to be called the semantic approach, the approach that represents theories in terms of sets of sentences or sets of propositions. And he and others have shown how they claim on that approach they can do much of what the semantic approach claims to do. I still think the semantic approach has certain advantages, but I'm willing to concede that one can approach these historical case studies using other formal devices. And indeed, I think, interestingly, I think this is what Mitch has shown us, what von Neumann did with quantum mechanics. Von Neumann wasn't arguing this is the theory, and here's how we represent it in terms of Hilbert space and vectors. He was basically, as I indicated before, pulling out certain features of scientific practice and formalizing those. And as Ottavio and others have pointed out, von Neumann himself wasn't happy with Hilbert space for other reasons that we don't, with the Hilbert space formulation, for other reasons that we don't need to go into here. So finally, what are the implications of all this for the history of science and philosophy of science relationship? This is a sort of a very contentious and recently much discussed issue. If you do a quick scan of the papers that are out there in Studies and Synthesa and other journals, you'll find a plethora of what I would characterize as meta-level relationships between the history of science and the philosophy of science. Joe Pitt pointed out, for example, years ago, that quite often this relationship is presented as a confrontational one. The history of science is drawn upon to undermine certain accounts in the philosophy of science. That's essentially what Cartwright, Suarez, and Schomar were trying to do with their account of the development of the London and London model, trying to show that it undermined the semantic approach. There are iterative approaches to this relationship, hermeneutic approaches. Again, we can discuss these in the discussion period. I think they're all motivated by different philosophical views, really, within the philosophy of science, and different views of how that relationship should be framed. I think one that I find particularly useful and interesting is some recent work by Katharina Kinzel, who urges us to consider case studies as forms of narrative. And you can see why that fits in with what Potters is telling us. Instead of seeing case studies in terms of these kinds of snapshots, look at them as a kind of narrative. The problem is that immediately that raises concerns about a form of theory ladenness, in the sense that our own, in presenting a case study as a narrative, our own theoretical, i.e. philosophical preconceptions will come into play. And this is well known and commonly discussed in the history of science, right? I mean, what you choose to pick out from the history, right, is going to be informed by your philosophical concerns. And as Kinzel goes on to point out, that means that case studies at best can provide only limited evidential support for certain philosophical claims. And typically, she says, historical case studies cannot settle philosophical conflicts because they actually presuppose certain philosophical positions to begin with, just in their formulation. Now that's well taken, but I'll come back to that in a second. I think this, as I said, this fits very nicely with the upshot of Jan Potter's analysis. If we revisit certain practices as presented in a case study, and I would add, by virtue of dropping the focus on the model or theory as some kind of entity, as reified, what we get is a new and more complex narrative that would lead to a new and more complex philosophical account. And one can see how this might in turn fit or mesh with those kinds of accounts like that of Scholl and Ratz, adopt an iterative view. Of course, we may begin with a certain philosophical preconception in mind, construct a certain narrative that then leads us to revise or reform in certain ways those philosophical preconceptions. And they view this as, or in terms of the framework of of what they call piecemeal conceptual engineering. But that still leaves the question, okay, what is then the relationship between the more complex narrative and the philosophical account? What is going to be on this, okay, fine, we've got this more nuanced view of historical case studies as narratives. What's that mean for the philosophy of science? And there's a very nice paper by Maria del Rosario Martinez Ordaz and Luis Estrada Gonzalez, published in the Journal of the Philosophy of History a few years ago, where they point out that this plethora of different views of the history of science, philosophy of science relationship has to do with very different views of what count as the relevant epistemic methodological virtues that we're seeking to reveal, to exemplify. What is it that we're looking for in a case study? And that leads to very different evaluations of the historical reconstructions. And so what they suggest is that we should replace the question, what makes a particular reconstruction of a scientific episode the best one, with the question, under what circumstances and for what purposes is one reconstruction more philosophically virtuous than another, where they take more virtuous as enhancing our philosophical understanding. Now, that's a bit of a catch-all, and we can talk about what it is to generate philosophical understanding, but they equate it with the possibility of illustrating, clarifying, conveying philosophical concepts through their exemplification in some historical case, either because some set of properties are instantiated or because concepts are embodied in a certain way, and so on. And they compare case studies to toy models or simplified representations, like the frictionless plane. They enhance our understanding by exemplifying certain features of our philosophical theses and readily bringing them to mind. And so they propose what they call this historiographical reinforcement criterion, that historical reconstruction could be philosophically virtuous if it reinforces a thesis in some way. And they have strong reinforcement cashed out in terms of the reconstruction providing a rationale for the thesis. And then they have weak reinforcement cashed out in terms of reconstruction contributing to a better understanding of the thesis, illustrating the mechanisms relevant for that understanding, clarifying some of the concepts, and so on. Well, going back then to the London and London case, I'm coming to the end of my presentation now. What are the philosophical theses in play there? Well, one was this debate between top-down and bottom-up views of model construction and the involvement of theory. The upshot, as I said, of Potter's analysis was that simplified case studies tell a distorted narrative and reinforce simplified, distorted philosophical theses. And perhaps contentiously, I think one can suggest that that was the case for Popper's falsificationism, for example. It was a simple philosophical thesis that was subjected or rejected on the basis of simplified case studies and actually more nuanced case studies lead to a much more sophisticated view of scientific methodology. I think on this point, contra Martinez, Ordaz, and Estrada Gonzalez, we should suggest that not all case studies should be conceived of as akin to toy models. I think toy case studies lead to toy philosophy. And I think what Jan Potters and others have shown us is that new and more complex practice-based narratives lead to new and more complex, in their terms, more virtuous philosophical accounts. But what about the other philosophical thesis in play, which had to do with the application of the partial structures variant of the semantic approach? Here, I think we could say that the London case study at least weakly reinforces the semantic approach, which is thereby rendered philosophically virtuous by contributing to a better understanding of it, illustrates the mechanisms, partial isomorphisms, for example, that are relevant for the understanding of the semantic approach. And the framing offered by that approach in terms of partial structures contributes to a better understanding of the practices presented in the historical episode considered. Of course, someone like Lutz or perhaps Cartwright, Suarez, and Schomar can say, well, we can say the same of alternative approaches. That's fine. I think these different approaches can be said to be differentially philosophically virtuous for different purposes. I still think the semantic approach, particularly as in the partial structures variant, is more virtuous than the alternatives when it comes to meta representing inter-theory and theory data relations. Okay, and we can talk a little bit about what do we mean by more virtuous. Just as an aside, in his classic paper on structural realism, James Laden wrote, I'm going to adopt the semantic approach in order to present structural realism, because the semantic approach, as it were, wears the structures on its sleeve. It sort of makes explicit these structures. And so you can understand it as being more virtuous in respects such as that. Okay, conclusion. Thinking of theories as akin to, strange attractors, the phrase we find in chaos theory, in some kind of abstract theory space to which scientists naturally gravitate, yields a distorted narrative of the history of science and hence an impoverished philosophy of science. Deprivileging theories, okay, and focusing on the practices as the truth makers for statements that are putatively about the theories helps to reinforce more virtuous philosophical accounts. And my hope is that by acknowledging that there are no theories out there as abstract entities, world three entities, abstract artifacts, or whatever, may open the door to a more fruitful conception of the relationship between the history of science and the philosophy of science. And I'll finish there. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the interesting talk. Now, your question, Octavio.
Okay. So first of all, Stephen, thanks for such a rich and very interesting talk. I really like it. So, of course, I'm very sympathetic with a lot of the points. So I just want to separate two things first, and then ask you to make a suggestion. So, of course, you're quite right about in emphasizing the importance of not reifying theories. But when we say that theories do not exist or that there are no such things as theories, we're also reifying them, right? We'll be reifying them in the negative. So I think the true lack of reifying theories is to be agnostic about that and separate the ontological issues, whether theories exist or not, what they are, what they are not, from whatever role the things that look like theories may play in the practice. So I think your heart is exactly on the right place when you say, look, if we don't reify we will be more sensitive to the practice, which is what ultimately matters as philosophers of science. We're trying to make sense of that practice, including the history behind. So my suggestion would be take seriously the idea of known reification, right? And then just leave it open, right? The issue about whether theories exist or not as a piece of sort of ontologizing philosophical fiction, right? And so you leave that aside and then look at the case studies for what they are, which is what in effect you do when in your own practice, right? When you're thinking about what happened with the London and London case. Now, if you do that, I think you can offer a more robust response to the very interesting challenge that Potter's offered. Because I actually thought you gave too much way for him, more than you had to. So for example, when he complains, right, the interpretation of a model should not be taken as something established at the moment when it's constructed, you need to understand that, of course, there may be changes in what a model means or what the model does over time. But when it's offered, when London and London offered their model, they had an intention. There was some phenomena that they were trying to account for, whatever resources. You cannot leave that and say, oh, look, that's not settled. You need to wait until the story unfolds so that we know what it is that they were talking about. If we do that, we're going to miss how the history was done, right, at the time in which it was doing. So in that sense, I think you're right. You can grant the point that, of course, what a model is and what it represents may change as the events unfold. But that doesn't mean that there was not something there when the model was first introduced. And I think exactly one of the issues, the nice feature about the partial structures approach is the openness that it allows to accommodate, including these variations in the roles of the model, right? Similarly, when then Potter's complains, look, we cannot, it's difficult to speak about the connection between the phenomenon and the model, right? Of course, you cannot say that in general, but you can say in each moment in time, what was it that London and London were trying to do at that moment, in that first paper? How that changed in a second paper, right? And you can track those changes. Okay. Well, you see where I'm going with this.
Yeah.
Right?
Okay. No, I think there's two, in a way, I think with regard to the latter half of your comments, I think we're basically on the same page. It's just an issue of maybe just emphasis. On the first point, though, reification, no, I can't buy into that. I don't understand negative reification. That just, like, I mean, come on, stop being such a wishy-washy agnostic, Ottavio. Look, I mean, take God. Okay, let's get contentious. Take God, right? I mean, why should I be agnostic about God? There's no evidence for God, so I'm going to be an atheist about God. And then you're saying, well, am I negatively reifying God? No, I'm precisely not reifying God. I'm denying his, it, hers existence. And I think the same goes for theories. I mean, I could be slightly wishy-washy and say, yeah, Ottavio, I think you've got a point. But what I wanted to explore in the book was a kind of atheism about theories, see how far we can push a limit. I have to be honest, there is a certain element of that. It is a bit like, ooh, let's see how far I can push this idea. But actually, as I started to push it, I started to think, you know what it's like? You have an idea and you start to explore it, and then you kind of, the very act of exploration convinces you, yeah, there's something to this. This is right. I am now completely convinced of my own idea. And I am completely convinced that I think the best way is simply not to reify, to adopt this eliminativist view completely. But I think, and here's where I think we can be on the same page, it's not going to matter in terms of the work that you and I have done and hopefully will do, that is analyzing theories or analyzing practices in terms of the partial structures approach. All that will happen, it will be just like you and I on realism, anti-realism. Yeah. All that will happen is where you say, right, at this point, there's a theory here and it's standing in this relationship with this phenomenon, and we can capture that in the semantic approach, right? And you and I can talk about, and we have to put in the context, and there's this piece of mathematics that we need to refer to, and so on. And while you're thinking that, I'm thinking, there's no theory there. But what there is our construction of a putative theory in terms of, the partial structures. So there's a sort of more, I'm adopting this kind of, what you might call a more constructivist attitude. And this is interesting, Ottavio, because it's almost like we switched positions when it comes to realism. Suddenly, I'm the anti-realist. I like this. Suddenly we've swapped. But I think we can, in terms of what we do as philosophers of science, as long as we, you might say, okay, but come on, French, you just talked about the implications. It has to make some difference. I think whether you're agnostic or atheist, I think if you stop thinking of the theories as out there in some kind of theory space to which the practices were naturally leading or which are naturally formulated, I think as soon as you stop doing that, whether you adopt an agnostic or an atheistic stance, you open yourself, as I said before, you open up space for a much richer and nuanced account. And I agree, in effect, that's what we were always doing. So I have played it. I've been a little harsh on our own work, right? Because I didn't want to seem a little triumphalist and say, well, Cartwright and Suarez and Sherman are clearly wrong. And even though Potters has criticized us, we're more right than they were. I do think that our series of papers is much closer. Jan has added further details, but it's much closer to what he's doing. I think you can put our papers together and see that there's a narrative there. I think this is a good point, actually. Maybe I'll include this in the next version of the talk. There already is a narrative there, and it's one that is shaped by the semantic approach. I think that's a very good point and a very fair point. But I still, on my view, and you can take this as a flaw in my view, and I think it's an interesting feature or opportunity for further thought. I do think there is a sense in which we have representation without the representation. There isn't something out there like a painting that's doing the representation. By virtue of our thinking of science in terms of representation, we construct the representation. It's kind of the idea that I had in mind. But yeah, there's always more to be said. Yeah,
that's great. Thanks a lot, Stephen.
No,
send me the slides and the paper.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep.
Gracias, Octavio. Next question, Christian, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Stephen, for a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed listening to what you have said. I read the book. I have the book here.
Oh, thank you.
And yeah, it's an amazing book, as always. But I have a couple of doubts. I'm only going to go for one of them, so we have more time to listen to other questions. While reading your book, and by getting to the end of it, I had this impression that at the end of the day, we still do have theories. We still theorize about things. We talk about things, build representations about them. We apply mathematics in our theorizing. My feeling was what changes here is not that suddenly there are no more theories in scientific practice, but what changes is our way of conceiving them, of conceiving theories, I mean. Perhaps the problem was this very strong distinction between the syntactic and the semantic view of scientific theories, while, where philosophers, and that draw the distinction initially, had very good reasons to think that theories were like the god of our narrative about scientific practice. But, after that, and after a couple of decades, 30 or 40 years after that distinction, we may say, well, we don't need to reify theories. We don't need to put them at the very center of our understanding of scientific practice. But that, my impression was, and I want to hear what you think about it, but that doesn't mean that we need to go as far as to say, there are no scientific theories, there is no representation about physical domains. Of course, we don't have to reify scientific theories. They are not things as, trees and electrons and so forth. But don't we still have scientific theories?
Thanks. No, I guess my worry is then, well, in what sense do we have scientific theories? I mean, if you say, well, we have them in the sense that scientists talk about them and write about them and present and refer to them in papers. Yeah, I think if you're going to take that talk, my worry is if you take that talk seriously, then that there are theories in that sense, then you're required to give some account of them, some kind of metaphysical account. And to their credit, I think the likes of Ron Geary kind of faces up to that and says, yeah, we have to accept that theories are abstract entities. And Popper, I mean, for all that, we might think that his distinction between worlds 1, 2, and 3 is kind of weird, right? I think, you know, there's a certain honesty to it. He says, look, you know, there's taking seriously talk of theories, just as taking seriously talk of pieces of music or works of literature raises an interesting ontological issue. And he resolves it by placing them in this world 3. I guess you could adopt, I have suggested this in another paper, and I'll be honest with you, this view that I'm about to suggest was a chapter in the book that got cut. You could adopt a quietist attitude, and maybe that fits with Ottavio's. So you could just say, look, I'm not going to get into the ontology of theories. I'm going to be a quietist about that. I think that in itself generates certain problems. It somehow feels like a bit of a Weasley way out. You're saying there are theories, but you're refusing to say what there are. It's like, I feel the same way about that as I do about certain realists about the electron. You know, when a realist says, yes, I believe there are electrons. Okay, what are they? Are they little bits of stuff? Are they the endpoints of strings? Are they structure? Oh, I'm not going to talk about that. What's the content of your realism? If you're not willing to tell us, you know, even if you just say, oh, whatever our best theories tell us about electrons. Okay, what do our best theories tell us in metaphysical terms? If you're not willing to do that, I fail to grasp the content of your realism. Likewise, if you insist, sorry, this is going to sound a bit aggressive, Christian, I don't mean it to be, but if you insist there are theories, but don't tell me what they are in ontological metaphysical terms, I find it difficult to grasp the content of your claim that there are theories. And what I try to argue in the book, as you know, is to say we can eliminate them ontologically, but still make sense of what scientists say by using this device. I would hope that that would be a sort of honest position like Popper's, but, you know, on the other side of the coin.
Yeah, it is. Well, thank you so much.
Sure. No, thank you.
Thank you, Christian. Next question, Raúl.
Gracias, Steven, por su charla. Yo voy a hacer una pregunta en español. La pregunta sería la siguiente. Gran parte de la metafísica de Steven se realiza con mucho conocimiento de la ciencia contemporánea, en particular de la mecánica cuántica. La filosofía, a medida que Steven la está haciendo, está mirando a la práctica científica y a la historia de la ciencia. ¿Puede decir por qué los científicos deberían prestar atención a la filosofía e historia de la ciencia?
So the question was, why should the scientists care about the history and philosophy of science?
The question is, why should the scientists care about the history and philosophy of science?
Why the science should care about philosophy and history of science? Considering that you're related with the scientific practice and the history of science.
Sorry, I'm not sure. There's one view, which is that, you know, why should they care, right? They're busy building their Large Hadron Collider and, you know, coming up with their theories. There's at least one view that says, look, don't mess with the scientists, just leave them to get on with their work. As long as they don't, you know, construct a black hole over at CERN and destroy us all, let them get on with it. And then our job is to try and understand what they're doing. The alternative view is, I actually think it's probably a good idea for scientists, at least as part of their formation, as part of their education, to have an idea both of, as it were, where they come from, where, you know, the history of their subject, and also of, you know, some of the philosophical implications and features of it. The problem is, this is me being a bit reflective in my old age, what we teach them in our courses on the philosophy of science and the history of science and the philosophy of physics is precisely what the like of Potters and others say is poor history of science. It's like little potted histories or little potted, you know, philosophies of science. So for years and years and years and years, I taught philosophy of physics here at Leeds. And most of the people in the class were physics students. I think, to be honest, most of them were there because it allowed them to get out of certain advanced maths classes. But anyway, they were there, and we would give them little potted histories and little potted philosophies of physics. Was that a good thing? I think it probably was on balance, because it opened their eyes to, both the history and, as I say, the philosophical implications. Would it have impacted on their scientific work? Nah, probably not. The one case in which I think I can make a stronger claim is that years and years and years ago, Dean Rickles and Juha Saatsi and I put on a symposium at the PSA on quantum gravity. And we had Lee Smolin and John Baez and others involved. And John Baez did actually say that he thought that thinking carefully and philosophically about the foundations of quantum gravity was actually a good way of perhaps finding a way forward with regard to that theory. And I think Carlo Rovelli, the physicist, has said something similar, that we've reached a point in theoretical physics where philosophical reflection might help find a way forward. I think that would be nice, but I'm a little skeptical myself because, I think, when you press physicists on this, when you press Carlo Rovelli, it's not entirely clear that I won't say that, but it's not entirely clear that physicists have a full and complete and nuanced grasp of all the philosophical positions in play. I mean, I'm rambling on a bit, but just consider quantum mechanics, right? So here's another piece of propaganda. Juha Saatsi and I just published a collection of essays from various people on different interpretations of quantum mechanics. There is significant underdetermination there, which would gladden the heart of the anti-realist like Ottavio. Okay, and can philosophy help with that? It's just not at all clear. It's going to, precisely because the philosophical principles that you might apply in order to select one interpretation over another are themselves going to be contested by other philosophers. So anyway, sorry, Raoul, that takes me slightly off the point of your question. Yes, I think it's a good thing in general, just as I think, scientists should learn something about English or Spanish or Portuguese literature and art. I think they should learn some history and philosophy of science. Will it help advance physics? Pretty skeptical myself. But I'm getting old now, so I'm getting more skeptical in my old age. That's what happens.
So thank you, Stephen, very much for this wide talk, and it's very interesting. I want to ask specific things related with the previous question. One is if you can point some things about theory change and how your view will help in the idea of theory change. And the idea would say, well, theory change, now we'll have theory practice change, practice that are changing through the time. So what kind of identity you can use to identify what is going on, apart from a lot of things doing scientifics in the science, people in their labs and things like that. And related with that point, my question will be, what do we do with the scientists that they think they are theories? And that, I think, is quite common thing, that they think they are theories. So the point is, should they be concerned about philosophy of science? You go on to them to say, well, no, there is no such a thing. So you believe in something that there is not such a thing. I think it's a very important point, and that is history of philosophy. Many people can talk about things there are, and philosophers say, no, there is not that kind of thing, and that's quite interesting. But let me point, probably is in your book, I don't know, but in the case of the painting, you have a painting, but there is, some people say, well, there is not such a thing as a painting. There is a lot of paint, canvas and wood and a lot of things, and there is not paint. There is not such a thing. There's just a lot of things mixed together, and there is not such a thing. That's obvious. Yes, in some sense, it's obvious materially, but somehow human beings and scientists here will say, well, we talk about theories, and we talk about theories in a very relevant sense, and to changes, no, there is something that's a process, people painting, and then the result is painting in the canvas. So what do you say to those people? They believe there is something there. And I think it's quite important for the scientists to say, well, there's no such a thing as what you believe. Thank you.
Okay, so two questions, one to do with theory change, one to do with the scientists. I mean, what to do with the scientists, hit them with my book. Sorry, I mean, basically, I mean, it's a little bit, look, again, sorry, I'm swapping positions with Ottavio. Suppose I was an anti-realist and scientists say, well, look, there really are electrons. There really are. You know, I believe in them. And then what you say, really? Really? Okay. And then you know, what you'd have to do is basically take them through sort of usual anti-realist arguments. What do you mean you believe in electrons? Well, we can see them. We can see them with our electron microscopes. Really? Really? What's going on there? You know, you take them through all the mediation that goes on in that act of observation and so forth. Or you might say, okay, but what is the content of your belief in the electron? What do you mean when you say, I believe there is an electron? How do you conceive of the electron? Then you can point out all the problems with that concept and the kind of stuff that Decio and I have looked at. I think the same thing with the theory. If a scientist, you know, were to say to me, look, there are theories, clearly there are theories, I would say, well, I mean, the obvious thing would be to say this might be quite mean, all right, point to one, right? And then they'll say, well, here it is, French, and they might hit me. And, you know, if I'm hitting them with the book, they might hit me with their scientific paper. Here it is, it's right there in your face. It's like, well, there's some marks on a piece of paper. Is that what you're saying a theory is? Here's another piece of paper. There's different marks on it. Those marks are in English, these marks are in Spanish. Is that a different theory? No, it's the same theory. So something goes beyond the marks. What is it that goes beyond the marks of paper? And so on and so on. I mean, basically, what I'm talking about is some kind of Maoist re-education of scientists, right? I don't want to do that, okay? You know, I'm happy for scientists to continue to talk as if there were theories. But if they come into my office or they come into my classroom, I'm going to feel inclined to disabuse them of the notion along those lines. You know, they might say, Pete Vickers and I have talked about this, you know, they might say, the theory is what I have in my mind, right? Well, then, okay, fair enough. Is it the same theory that I have in my mind when I look at you presenting the theory that is in your mind on the whiteboard? As I've mentioned in the book, there's Collingwood had a theory of music, for example, that basically insisted that you have something that's in the composer's mind, it's then performed, and then you have something that is formed in each audience member's mind, but what that thing is quite different. So there is no, you know, one Beethoven's fifth. There are multiple Beethoven fifths, depending on the number of people hearing these sounds. That was Collingwood's quite radical view. Part of what I try and do in the book is to look at all these different, or a number of different views of artworks, and in some cases say, and look, you know, maybe we can say the same thing about theories. And then I just point out some of the problems inherent in them. Each time we try and make sense of what it is to say there are theories, I think we run into problems. In a sense, the book is a kind of exercise in exasperation, because in the end, I just got exasperated and said, right, that's it. That's it. There are no theories. Let's try and make sense of that. Well, okay, we can to a certain extent. Now, coming back to the theory change. Yeah, look, actually, this is something I was in. Maybe I should have given a different talk, because one of the talks I was thinking of doing is, okay, how does the realism, anti-realism debate look from this other perspective? And part of that debate has to do with theory change and how we see theory change. I have to be honest, I haven't really thought this through, right? Because that's partly why I didn't give that version of the talk. But I don't think switching to my kind of account somehow has a major impact on the realism, anti-realism debate, in the sense that the anti-realist argument from theory change against realism somehow gets undermined. It doesn't. I think what you could say is, okay, let's go to Laden and his famous paper about the history of science and the history of theory change. All right. That's clearly quite a simplified account. If we de-emphasize theories and focus on practices, we get a much more nuanced account, much more sophisticated, instead of just saying, oh, you know, at this point we believed in the crystalline spheres, at this point we didn't, at this point we believed in classical physics, at this point we believed in quantum physics. I think it becomes much more complex. As I tried to indicate, the transition from classical to quantum physics was in a sense, that transition is something that gets imposed on the history after the fact. I don't think it undermines necessarily the central anti-realist point about shifting ontologies. You know, even if you decenter theories, you've still got these changing practices which would support the claim that you've got changing ontologies that raise problems for the standard kind of realist. I would hope they would still not raise problems for the structural realist. I would still insist that there's a commonality of structure that one can discern in the practices. But obviously, you know, that discerning of structure is going to be something that is revealed by my own shaping of that historical narrative in terms of, say, the partial structures approach. And so it's open to objection on that basis. But I don't see any particular way around that. I do think it would encourage us to look at theory change in what I would hope would be a more sophisticated fashion. I don't think it blunts the force of the theory change argument in the realist, anti-realist debate, or not completely.
Thank you.
Gracias, Andrés. La palabra la tiene Octavio.
Stephen, this is just a follow-up question to you. There is a way of framing the issue about theories in which you can have your cake and eat it, right? So you can say there are theories, but they do not exist, right? So if you make that separation and say, look, you can quantify over objects that do not exist, right? So, and that would allow you to say in a very clear, straightforward sense, yeah, we follow when the science says that there is Newtonian physics, and then it was replaced by a different kind of mechanics. You can take them literally without having any existential import, right? And keeping a form of, if you want, an agnosticism, right? I don't think we have changed places because, as you know, the anti-realism that I favor is agnostic, right? So I just want to be consistent. Well, be agnostic about that too. And I thought that was sort of one way of framing the question that Christian was asking. When we can talk about, scientists do talk about, right? There being those theories, but you don't need to take them as being committed to their existence.
No, I agree. Okay, so first, I was being a bit cheeky talking about changing places. But no, I think that's interesting. It's a bit like, what's his name?
Azuni, Jody?
Azuni, yeah. So certainly, I think you can allow scientists to talk about theories without taking them or us to be committed to the existence of theories. So on the Azuni line, yeah, what you need to go when it comes to unobservables to be able to say they actually exist, there's certain criteria that have to be met. Mm-hmm. And the argument would be that in the case of theories, those criteria aren't or cannot be met by virtue of the way that they're conceived. I think that's an interesting account. I don't know, I'm not quite sure whether it conflicts with my view. Partly, I guess, because, forgive me, Christian, I'm not quite sure of the import of, we could give a short-term reassurance to scientists who might be worried, as if they would be, right? But if they were worried, we could say, look, you can still believe in theories, but sotto voce, they don't exist, right? But then I would want, in the long term, my Maoist inclination will come out and say, right, you're all off to the re-education camp because I'm tired of hearing you talk about theories as if they exist when they actually don't. And I'm going to show you how to really understand your own talk. That goes back to Raoul's point. I mean, in effect, if scientists were to take my philosophy of science class on this, that's what would happen. They'd all come out at the end of it saying, oh, we were all talking about theories as if they exist, but now we know that they don't. But we can still talk about them because what our talk is doing is making true certain claims that are putatively about theories, but the theories actually aren't there, they don't exist. So I don't see a conflict there.
It's not a conflict. I think it's a cleaner way of doing it. Right. I think it's a better maneuver than the one that Ross Cameron developed.
Oh, I see. Oh, you think so?
Yeah, because you don't need to talk about truth makers. That brings a lot of extra metaphysical baggage that you don't need to buy in. Certainly not given your more anti-realist stance towards theories. So you can make sense of take scientific practice literally right? You don't need to rewrite any of the practice, engage with what scientists are doing in their own terms, understand what they are up to without rewriting things, without attributing to them truth-making talk or any of that. I think it's much cleaner.
First of all, I don't see necessarily that further baggage. And the thing that still worries me is it still niggles me a little bit with regard to Zuni on mathematical entities and so on. Just the sense in which one takes the statement that there are X. Okay, and I guess what the scientists won't be aware of, but we will, is that we're understanding that word are in a certain way.
It's very straightforward. You are just quantifying over objects in the domain. That's all. The only thing you're doing. You're just talking about some of them instead of all of them.
Okay. I mean, in a certain sense, look, I am, again, in my old age, quite relaxed about these devices that we use. And so if you say, look, here's a better device than the Ross Cameron, I think we can have a discussion about that and the pros and cons of each. I'm not necessarily even willing to say it has to be one or the other. Maybe here's a Weasley way out, right? In talking amongst us, I would prefer the Ross Cameron approach because, you know, people in this forum know what we mean by truth makers and so on. If I was talking to a bunch of scientists, right? Maybe I'll go for the Zuni approach because hopefully they'll understand what it is to quantify over a domain, right? And they're not going to be bothered by that. Philosophers might say, well, there are issues there too, right? There are, you know, Zuni's approach is not without some criticism. So all these devices come with pros and cons. So I could just backtrack and be a pluralist about them and say, well, okay, maybe it depends who your audience is. The point is to be the double-edged point, I think, that I want to still maintain is to be an eliminativist, not an agnostic about theories, but also to accommodate scientists and our own talk about theories. And there may be more than one device that allows us to do that. That's my eclectic, all-embracing approach. But that's interesting. I honestly hadn't thought of that line when writing the book.
That's good. Thank you.
Next question, Osvaldo.
Hi, Steve.
Hey.
You talked about theories, right? Would you extend this analysis to laws as well?
I wouldn't, because I'm a mad structuralist, and I think laws correspond to primitive modal features of the world. I mean, they're expressed in those theoretical practices that we delineate as being, you know, theoretical. But my form of structural realism actually takes laws and symmetry principles and it does reify them. Oh yeah, I see no need to be sort of consistent in the sense of being an eliminativist about everything, theories and entities and the world and so on. So I'm quite prepared to say that there is a world out there. The world is structural in a certain sense, and that structure is expressed by law statements, and those law statements are feature in our theoretical practices. But I don't think there are any theories as things corresponding to those practices. You could try and, you know, say, look, if you're going to be an anti-realist about anything, you should be an anti-realist about everything. And I think there are some, I mean, Ottavio, there are some nominalists, right, who are like, you know, pure nominalists across the board. I think that's a hard line to take. And it's actually not that, I think in some respects, it's not that interesting a line. I'm more interested in seeing how I can be a realist about electrons in a certain sense, but an anti-realist about theories. But I think it's a very good question, because it's right, for my structural realism, laws are right there on the boundary, as it were.
Thank you, Stephen. This was a magisterial expression of your late thoughts. I enjoyed your Maoist approach. In the spirit of the previous question, which contained some of the things I wanted to ask about, laws and such, you hinted at the other aspect I wanted to invite you to comment on. So you suppose you convince us that there are no theories. Theories are out. And you have given us a rationale, nicely structured. And then why not have the same for everything else? Do you believe in anything? You say, I'm willing to believe in the world and so on. But shouldn't you apply your rationale? And if so, what becomes of your position? It would be a full Maoist position? What would it be?
I think the rationale for eliminating theories doesn't apply to eliminating the world. Okay. So, for example, the standard realist move, contested, of course, is to go from the success of theories to the claim that somehow they're latching onto the world. And that's cashed out in realist terms, as the theory is describing the world in a certain way. I think you can still adhere to all of that while saying there is no thing as an abstract entity corresponding to that theory, right? So there's marks on the whiteboard, there's marks in the paper, and those marks represent aspects of the world. I think you can be a realist about those aspects of the world without being a realist about some abstract entity that is instantiated somehow in those marks on the whiteboard or the paper. I see no reason, no grounds for going from the latter form of eliminativism to eliminating or being an anti-realist about the world. I think it's both perfectly compatible to hold both those views, and I just see no grounds for going from the one to the other than some kind of mad extreme nominalism that just says, right, I'm going to be a nominalist about absolutely everything. Let's see what happens. As I said at the very beginning of the talk, I think, to say there are no theories is not to say there are no entities to which our putative theories apparently refer or represent. Marks on the paper, marks on the whiteboard. The other way, the reasons for being a realist about aspects of the world, and again, these are contested, of course, i.e. having to do with the success of our theoretical practices, are not reasons that easily carry over to being a realist about theories as abstract entities. I don't see how you can make a kind of success argument, inference to the best explanation, say, about the existence of theories as abstract entities, or no miracles argument for theories as abstract entities, or any of the other rationales that you can give for being a realist about features of the world, whether you understand those features in terms of causally interacting entities or structures. I don't see that those arguments carry over to the case of theories.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Alberto. Thank you, Steven. Le doy la palabra a Andrés para el cierre.
Okay, thank you very much, Steven. That was a wonderful talk, as Alberto put it perfectly. It was a magisterial talk, so that was perfect for our purposes. And the idea of this association that is history and philosophy of science, so this was wonderful at the end, they talk about that. So it's quite relevant, and I will say it was waiting for you to come to AFHIC and give it such a nice talk. So thank you very much. Very, very glad to hear. There will be more talks in the future, but thank you very much. Thank you everyone for being here. Muchas gracias a todos. Nos veremos la próxima.
Muchas gracias a todos.
Thank you.
Gracias.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Steven.